Okay, awesome. Just want to make sure. Awesome. All right, welcome to today's forum. My name is Rory Stewart, and I will be today's forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute here at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science, and we want to thank Professor Steve Johnston for his leadership in organizing this year's the Neil A. Maxwell Lecture in Political Theory and Contemporary Politics. Today's forum is titled Beauty, Brokenness, and All That Remains, a Rasquache Ethos of Abundance. And we are excited to be joined by an incredible speaker and two distinguished commentators. I will turn it over to Professor Steve Johnston to introduce our guests.
Thank you all for coming. As you know, my name is Steve Johnston. I have the honor of holding the Neil A. Maxwell Chair. And I mention that because I'd like to thank the Friends of Neil Maxwell for organizing that chair and providing the money that makes this kind of event possible. I also thank my colleagues in the Political Science Department and also the Hinckley Institute. So they provide us with this fabulous facility here, and a shout out to Nick Cockrell in particular, whom I've been working with for years here at Hinckley, and he does a great job every year. So thank you, Nick. We really appreciate all your efforts on our behalf. So before I introduce our guests, I'll just tell you the format. So Professor Beltran will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then Professors Pitts and Beard will speak, and they'll speak for roughly 10 minutes or so. And then we will go to questions for you for about half an hour. And over the course of that half an hour, Professor Beltran can also answer any questions and concerns that Professors Beard and Pitts may have. So I'll introduce our commentators first. Lisa Beard is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Western Washington University. They are the author of If We Were Kin, Race, Identification, and Intimate Political Appeals, published by Oxford University Press. The book was based on their 2017 dissertation, which won the American Political Science Association's Best Dissertation Award in Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. They are also the co-editor of Conversations with Black Women in Politics, Using Oral History to Measure Impact, which is forthcoming from SUNY Press. They have published articles in political theory, comparative political theory, contemporary political theory, National Political Science Review, which is now National Review of Black Politics, and the American Political Science Review. Andreas Pitts is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Buffalo. They are the author of Nos Outras, Gloria E. Anzaldúa, Multiplicitous Agency and Resistance, published by SUNY Press. And they are co-editor of 3 books, Trans Philosophy, published by University of Minnesota Press, Theories of the Flesh, Latinx and Latin American Feminisms, Transformation and Resistance, published by Oxford University Press, and Beyond Bergson, Examining Race and Colonialism Through the Writings of Henri Bergson, published by SUNY Press. Their current book project is entitled Latina, Latinx, Abolitionist Feminisms Incarceration, Agency, and Coalitional Politics, which examines the philosophical contributions made by U.S. Latinx activists and scholars critiquing state violence, prisons, and policing from the 1960s to the early 2000s. Cristina Beltran is Associate Professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. Her first book, The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity, was published by Oxford University Press and won the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award for the best book in political science on ethnic and cultural pluralism. It also won the American Political Science Association's Race, Ethnicity, and Politics Section Award for the best book on racial and ethnic political identities, ideologies, and theories. And it won the 2012 Casa de las Americas Award for best book in Latino studies in the United States. Professor Beltran's second book, Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy, was published by the University of Minnesota Press and won the American Political Science Association's Latino Caucus Best Book Award for the best book in political science in Latino politics, Latino studies. Among other projects, she is currently completing a book entitled Latinos and Other Uncertainties on Desire, Difference, and the Rise of Multiracial Conservatism, of which today's lecture is a part. She has published a wide range of articles in leading theoretical journals, including Political Theory, Politics and Gender, Contemporary Political Theory, Polity, the Du Bois Review, Aztlán, a journal of Chicano studies, and Political Research Quarterly. She was also the co-editor of Theory and Event, one of the leading journals in the subfield of political theory from 2019 to 2024. So those are our distinguished visitors, so please help join me in welcoming them. I'll turn it over to Professor Beltran.
Thank you so much. So I think this microphone works. Yes? You can hear me? Oh, good. Wonderful. Well, I am so thrilled to be here and so thrilled to see so many people whose work I'm inspired by in this room and also all the students, and just really thrilled to be here. I want to especially thank Professor Steve Johnston for inviting me to give the Neil A. Maxwell Lecture in Political Theory and Contemporary Politics. And I especially want to thank my interlocutors, Professors Lisa Beard and Andrea Pitts, for agreeing to join me today and share in this conversation. I'm just thrilled to be here. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn on the timer of this so I do not just keep yammering at you people for too long. So let me get started. So as Professor Johnston said, my talk today is based on the conclusion of my forthcoming book entitled Latinos and Other Uncertainties on Desire, Difference, and the Rise of Multiracial Conservatism. And so much of that book is an exploration of the various ways in which Latinx and other racialized subjects are being drawn towards political conservatism and right-wing politics. Now, I should be clear about my perspective on this. As I discuss in the book, there have always been Latinos who are conservative, who are Republican, and there always will be. And this political moment, there are going to be Latinos who are attracted to the politics of MAGA. But because I'm a progressive, and I identify more with progressive and left politics, I'm invested in trying to recruit more Latinos and other populations to support more liberal and progressive politics. So I'll put my cards on the table. That's one of my commitments here. In the battle of ideas, I would like my side to win more and to lose less. And also because, like many people in this political moment, I think elements of MAGA conservatism have become really dangerous and a form of right-wing politics that I would like to see become smaller and weaker in the ensuing years. So in writing this book that thinks about Latino conservatism, I wanted to end it by thinking about the various ways that liberals and progressives might work to more successfully resist the logics of the right. So in this conclusion, of which is the basis of today's talk, I sought to explore how we might create transformational infrastructures that help loosen and reconfigure the ways we go about expressing our collective desire for more joy, more thriving, more justice, more pleasure, and more care for the world. I'm seeing that the video, it may take, I don't need it for like 10 minutes, so don't worry about it. So I refer to this idea of the politics of more as a politics of what I'm calling affective abundance. There it is. We'll see if it stays. If it goes away, we'll come back. It's a politics I'm calling affective abundance, right? Emotional abundance. It represents a form of what I'm describing as a kind of defiant, non-eliminationist politics that embraces the excessive and contradictory feelings that subjects feel about one another and the world we share. So in this chapter, I bring together the works of Eve Sedgwick, Lauren Berlant, Tomás Ibarra-Frausto, and Amalia Mesa Baines, tapping into the insights in Chicano aesthetics, queer and affect theory, and women of color feminism to craft lessons in the painful and beautiful labor involved in our ongoing work of sharing the world. As many scholars have argued, one of the many tragedies of white supremacy is how its violent legacies have damaged and distorted America's democratic imaginary. In the right-wing imaginary, politics is a zero-sum game. Calls for an anti-racist or gender-just society are often perceived as anti-white or anti-male, not a vision that imagines thriving for all of us. In this zero-sum worldview, if women are flourishing, men are being diminished and persecuted. If migrants are thriving, citizens are being rendered rightless. If secular and non-Christian subjects feel welcome, then Christianity is being demeaned and undermined. By this logic, an expanding or inclusive vision of membership is a kind of impossibility. Instead, multiracial, queer, trans, and feminist futures are envisioned not as spaces where everyone gets to thrive and flourish, but as a future that consigns straight, white, male, Christian, cisgender subjects and their conservative allies to subjugation and persecution. For MAGA conservatives, political adversaries of any race or gender who identify as progressive or left or liberal are not simply opponents with opposing political viewpoints, they're evil, right? Trump refers to them as the enemy within. As one New York Times journalist described it recently, quote, "The Trump administration's efforts to achieve its policy goals are not just an exercise in governance, but a holy mission against forces of darkness," unquote. Trump continually characterizes his Democratic opponents and liberals and progressive citizens as, quote, "communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs who live like vermin." Rhetoric that is characteristic of an ethos of dehumanization that seeks not to simply defeat, but to eliminate and render rightless those it opposes. In a recent interview with Fox News' Sean Hannity, White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller offered a vivid articulation of this worldview, stating, quote, "The Democratic Party does not fight for, care about, or represent American citizens. It is an entity devoted exclusively to the defense of hardened criminals, gangbangers, and illegal alien killers and terrorists. The Democrat Party is not a political party. It is a domestic extremist organization," unquote. In the right-wing imaginary, the politics of domination quickly becomes a politics of gross dehumanization. This dehumanizing ethos creates a politics in which leaders are unable to envision sharing power with those they have so thoroughly rendered unhuman and illegitimate. This is a politics that seeks to resolve conflict not by periodically defeating one's opponents in free and fair elections, but by disappearing them. It's a world-making dream of expulsion and erasure, purging political opponents from democratic institutions and civil society in order to permanently bar them from power. Equally important, because these fears and fantasies of domination and retribution shape their own political visions, the right can sometimes only imagine their enemies inflicting a similar form of domination and rightlessness upon them. Limited by a zero-sum imaginaries and their own fears and fantasies of domination, the right sometimes remains trapped in a delusional recursive feedback loop, convinced that their opponents are committed to inflicting a vengeful politics of ruination and replacement. In sum, the right's politics are not only zero-sum and scarcity-driven, they're profoundly eliminationist. And for me, it's this refusal to share the world that makes these politics so dangerous and so illiberal. It's what drives the right towards authoritarianism, and it's why I think it smacks of fascism. Because it seeks to eliminate what it opposes: immigrants, trans people, a federal government that will not obey, a press that questions and challenges. It's a zero-sum logic that can't imagine shared forms of rule and shared forms of thriving. Moreover, because the right continually projects its zero-sum eliminationist politics on everything it opposes and everyone it opposes, I think this is precisely why a democratic, an anti-authoritarian politics needs to refuse to dance to this tune and participate in this logic. right? We will not go forward well if we try to do some version of this. And one thing I talk about in the chapter that I'm not going to talk about so much here, but I can talk about in the Q&A, is I talk about the ways that I think sometimes liberals and the left also engage in forms of zero-sum thinking. I describe this as a form of affective withholding, where we end up approaching solidarity in zero-sum terms. So I don't argue that it's eliminationist, because I don't think it is, but I do think we sometimes withhold compassion. We withhold words of care to those we feel are undeserving of understanding or grace. But instead of participating in the right's scarcity logics, I'm trying to argue that an anti-fascist vision of the world has to reject the right's smallness and sadness, not by mimicking their assumptions and tactics, but by offering an alternative that is emotionally rich and defiantly anti-eliminationist, right? That acknowledges that we are all here. No one is going anywhere. And there's something both beautiful and full of possibility about that as well. Put another way, the logic of a just future cannot simply be correct or fair. A just future must also appear beautiful, playful, fun, and exciting to all those who are open to envisioning themselves as part of such multiracial democratic projects. Such visions of justice must be persuasive, enchanting, and plausible, particularly to those who remain uncertain, anxious, confused, and/or ambivalent about what kind of world might exist beyond a familiar, broken status quo. People who, after decades of neoliberal rule that has led to privatization and massive wealth inequality, these are people who often fear that radical change might lead to further losses, that might make their lives worse. They need visions of a future that are about more than reckoning and acknowledging inequality and privilege. They also need visions of an abundant future that seems expansive, joyful visions where the future can be more wonderful than the present, and within which they can imagine themselves and their families and their friends thriving and dwelling within. A politics of affective abundance, I want to argue, is a coalitional and popular front orientation that recognizes that we are both doomed and gifted to share the world with people whose desires, dreams, and impulses are as conflicted and abundant as our own. And while some of our fellow citizens will remain forever attached to a politics of domination and dehumanization, others, and I would argue many others, can be drawn into democratic majorities animated by freedom dreams that are richer and more pleasurable than the right's eliminationist impulses. So for the remainder of this talk, I want to explore what I mean by this concept and its relationship to a non-eliminationist ethos of sharing the world, and I want to do that by turning to the work of Lauren Berlant and the art and literary critic Tomás Ibarro Frausto and the curator, scholar, and visual artist Amalia Mesa Baines. So first I want to turn to the work of Lauren Berlant and their final posthumous work on the inconvenience of other people, which is a great title. The book explores the experience of inconvenience. As they put it, the feeling state that comes with sharing the world. For Berlant, inconvenience represents a fundamental condition of life. The fact, as they put it, we are, quote, inescapably in relation with other beings in the world and are continuously adjusting to them. At whatever scale or duration, we are all implicated in the pressures of coexistence, unquote. Of course, for historically subordinated populations, this experience feels something much deeper and much worse than merely inconvenience. And this inconvenience often exists at the way that Berlant describes it as a form of maximum intensity. Berlant cites acts of rape and anti-Black violence. We could also come up with examples like the politics of kidnapping and the mass deportation of migrants, the myriad efforts to demand a gender binary that disappears and denigrates trans people. Berlant acknowledges that there are times when the inconvenience of other people is better understood as the unbearable, a concept they previously theorized with Lee Edelman, as a, quote, overwhelming affect that feels like it might cause system collapse. The unbearable points to a system at its limit, a structure or a mind being tested until it appears to bend to the point of nearly giving out. Yet Berlant notes, quote, this is the paradox. To call a thing unbearable is to admit that it must be born. It is a limit case of inconvenience to the reproduction of life, unquote. This dilemma is why Berlant insists that there is an inevitability to this sense of inconvenience that has nothing to do with justice, neither fair nor avoidable. The ongoing fact is that we share this world. We are inescapably co-present with a myriad of inconvenient others. And Berlant's continual return to words like inevitable and inescapable reflects their central claim that we exist in a state of non-sovereign relationality with one another. We are forever entangled with one another, yet not in control. Moreover, as Berlant observes, not only do subjects seek to escape or transcend inconvenience, we also have a simultaneous desire for inconvenience, right? And Berlant offers examples like sex, democracy, and the commons as examples of how people are drawn towards inconvenient objects. Objects that, as they put it, quote, things that people say they want, are uneasy wanting, go in and out of caring about, and want to be okay with, unquote. We often want what we wish we didn't want. And while we can decide to act or not act on our wants and desires, our desires can never be fully mastered. Our desires are proliferative, contradictory, and sometimes incommensurable. Desire is itself an experience of non-sovereign relationality. So alongside the term inconvenience, ambivalence, loosening, and infrastructure are the other key terms Berlant offers for cultivating better ways of sharing and moving in a broken world. The dynamic character of ambivalence is a reminder that we are all emotionally abundant creatures. But our ambivalence and our multiplicity can be a source of loosening, a way of metabolizing inconvenience so that the troubles of a broken world appear movable and perhaps shareable. What I find powerful about Berlant's use of this language of loosening is it captures, I think, how we sometimes do shift in our consciousness. It makes me think also of yoga and other ways of moving where something kind of hurts, but then it feels good afterwards, or it hurts, but then you expand your range of motion, right? It's a way of, I think of Sarah Ahmed's work on orientation, right, and moving in different ways. Loosening, I think, captures the elusive experience that is often the process or precursor to change, either changing one's body or changing one's mind. Yet, as Berlant rightly notes, you can't simply lose your object if it's providing a fundamental world infrastructure for you. You can't decide not to be racist, not to be misogynist, not to be ambivalent about your anchors or fixations. But, they state, you can use the contradictions to loosen and reconfigure, exploiting the elasticity of its contradictions, the incoherence of the forces that overdetermine it, and that make every object seen an assemblage, unquote. In thinking about infrastructure, Berlant notes that one of the salient features of infrastructure is that it, quote, becomes visible upon breakdown, right? Think about when there's an electrical outage or the recent Amazon internet disaster, right? As Berlant puts it, infrastructure glitches. The glitch represents a moment that destabilizes our confidence about how things work. Yet for Berlant, the glitch can also be a moment of loosening, a way of making repair and innovation more imaginable, while also making the reality of breakdown less catastrophic. So let me now turn to the concept of rasquachismo, which I understand as an aesthetic sensibility that also represents a type of affective infrastructure, one that seeks to create abundance, often from scarcity, and that is resolutely non-eliminationist. But it's also an ethos that is familiar with a world that is always glitching. Visual culture and performance studies scholar Laura Gutierrez characterizes rasquachismo as a critical concept in Chicano culture and visual studies that came into academic usage in the late 1980s and is used to explicate a resourceful, working-class, neo-Baroque aesthetic sensibility. And now I'm going to try to use the PowerPoint. Look, there's an example. In his seminal 1989 essay, Rasquachismo, a Chicano Sensibility, Tomás Ibarra Frausto describes Rasquache as an irrepressible spirit manifested in the art and life of the Chicano community. Describing something as Rasquache was often used disparagingly to describe a certain barrio aesthetic. The term was later reclaimed to highlight the creativity and stylish ingenuity visible in Chicano and Mexicano communities, and to denote a certain aesthetic sensibility among Chicano and Latinx artists. Rasquache is a quality exemplified in objects and places, right? A car or a house can be rasquache, as well as individuals. An individual can look or act in a rasquache manner. Rasquachismo is often understood as a class-based aesthetic that is about making do with what one has. It's an aesthetic that often uses little bits and pieces, glass, broken pieces of pottery or jewelry, the tabs and bottle caps, and it uses these little bits and pieces in new or unexpected ways. Right? These are examples of you can make a purse out of this. In a way, Rasquachismo is a sensibility that finds forms of abundance even within certain forms of precarity or scarcity. It's an aesthetic sensibility reflected in the many ways that people use what they have to create something new. As Ibaro Frausto states, you create something that wasn't there before, and it's profound and beautiful and satisfying. That's the sensibility of Rasquachismo. The blending of both survival and pleasure reveals forms of resilience and creativity that spring, as I said, from making do with what's at hand. It provides an aesthetic sensibility that is also an ethos of survival. In the realm of taste, Ibaro Frausto writes, to be Rasquache is to favor the elaborate over the simple, the flamboyant over the severe. It often gets called a barrio baroque, right? And while high value is placed on making do with what you have, elaboration is preferred to understatement. Detailing this aesthetic, Ibaro Frausto writes, a Rasquache inclination piles pattern upon pattern, filling all available space with bold display. Limited resources means refixing and reusing everything. Things are not thrown away, but saved and recycled, often in a different context. Automobile tires used as plant containers, plastic beach bottles becoming garden ornaments, discarded coffee cans re-elaborated as plant and flower pots. According to Amalia Baines, the capacity to hold life together with bits of string and old coffee cans and broken mirrors in a dazzling gesture of aesthetic bravado is at the heart of Rasquachismo. For Mesa Baines, a feminist Rasquachismo, which she calls domesticana, can be seen in traditions of home altars, which are common to working class Chicanas, an innovative process of accumulation, display, and abundance that allows a commingling of history, faith, and the personal as families create ofrendas to welcome and grieve their dead. As an attitude of survival and inventiveness, to be Rasquache, as Ibaro Frausto puts it, is to be down but not out. He writes, in an environment where things are always on the edge of coming apart, the car, the job, the toilet, things are held together with spit, grit, and movidas. Movidas are whatever coping strategies you use to gain time, to make options, to retain hope. Living in the context of precarity, Rasquache is infrastructural in a Berlantian sense, a concept generated in the process of keeping things going, with the fact that breakdown is often the norm rather than the exception. Yet in its creativity and in its demand for pleasure and beauty, Rasquachismo is also an ethos that refuses to accept mere survival or simply adapt to a damaged world or a damaged life. If Berlant is correct, that to loosen an object is to look at recombining its component parts, in a sense to unlearn its objectness, then Rasquachismo is productively understood as a project and a practice of loosening. At its most literal, to be Rasquache often involves the actual use of objects in new ways, and we saw examples of how you could do that. As he says, things are not thrown away, but saved and recycled, often in a different context. But at a deeper level, I see Rasquachismo as a heuristic that invites us to see the broken or glitching object as still holding the possibility of use, and perhaps doing something different from what its original purpose claimed it was. The artwork and scholarship of Amalia Mesa Baines suggests yet another anti-eliminationist approach to metabolizing inconvenience. And so it's to her art and theorizing I'm going to turn. In her 5-decade career as an installation artist, curator, writer, teacher, and mentor, Amalia Mesa Baines is perhaps the best-known American artist working with altar installations. A MacArthur Fellowship winner with a PhD in clinical psychology, Mesa Baines was born in 1943 to parents who were undocumented and who left Mexico as young children. Mesa Baines describes growing up in an immigrant family of storytellers, agricultural workers, and healers who influenced her own interest in storytelling and working with found objects. Mesa Baines' aesthetic orientation offers insights into the power and beauty of embracing and also admitting our multitudinous feelings and desires about each other and the world we share. Mesa Baines' work is consistently characterized by what Maria Esther Fernandez describes as a rich, layered aesthetics that reflects decades of the artist collecting, archiving, and preserving of objects. The sensuous, strikingly beautiful quality of her installations reminds us that we have a rich array of options for approaching our conflicted and complex attachments, not as desires to be disavowed, but as feelings to be acknowledged, engaged, and played with. Her art makes visible some of the most powerful insights of women of color feminism and queer of color critique, particularly its capacious sense of identity and its willingness to speak honestly about our complex desires and its resistance to simplistic binaries and zero-sum thinking. For example, Mesa Baines's artwork, Mesa Baines's altars and ofrendas often depict a mix of religious and spiritual iconography that are also techniques of subversion. As with many Chicana artists, her work suggests deep engagements with spirituality and a feminist critique that resists either a full embrace or a rejection of Christianity and Catholic imagery and symbols. Instead, her installations repeatedly reference the violence of colonialism and the ongoing struggle for identity, while simultaneously locating her viewers in a rich sensorium of grief, beauty, wonder, spiritual renewal, and healing. Altars are spaces of love and memory and celebration, but they also reflect contradictory feelings and emotions. For Chicanas, creating altars and ofrendas for their loved ones is not only a site of grief and love, it can also be a site of anger, hurt, and unresolved emotions and other negative affects, feelings that are often made visible through the choices of what to place on the altar and how one layers and positions objects and photographs. As Mesa Baines writes, critical to the strategy of Domesticana is the quality of paradox, purity and debasement, beauty and resistance, devotion and emancipation are aspects of the paradoxical that activate Chicana Domesticana as a feminist intervention, unquote. Within the altar, conditions that appear in mutual opposition are mediated. In addition to being sites of grief, altars also invite consideration that the losses endured may also be emancipatory, as subjects struggle to move beyond relationships shaped by forms of domination and marginalization. Many of Mesa Baines's installations explore beauty as both a desire and a demand, a system of power that is enforced not only by men, but also by women, not only by words, but also by images, not only in the public sphere, but also in the privacy of the mind. Much of the artist's work lingers on questions of how desire and gender emerge in a patriarchal world and how this dynamic creates a set of ambivalent relations to the erotic. In her interviews, she has spoken about, and let me go back to, in her interview, she's spoken about her experience as a young adolescent contending with her developing body and the discomfort she sometimes felt being noticed by men, alongside the experience of watching Hollywood movies late at night with her mother and imagining, quote, being as beautiful and glamorous as Latina movie stars like Dolores Del Rio and Rita Hayworth. And this is part of the altar of Dolores Del Rio. Works such as An Ofrenda for Dolores Del Rio and Venus Envy, Chapter 1, which I was showing you earlier, or the First Holy Communion, Moments Before the End, evoke feelings of desire, pleasure, memory, and feminist critique. In Venus Envy, Chapter 1, Mesa Baines creates an installation that features satin dresses and silken wall hangings, turning the space into a boudoir chapel with a single chair at the vanity table. Yet Gonzalez also notes how Mesa Baines has taken a postcard image of Titian's 1538 painting of the Venus of Urbino, and she's put that into the folds of the soft satin communion dressings. This is Titian's 1538 Venus of Urbino. In Esther Gonzalez's reading, this image argues that the alluring nudity by putting this image into the story of Catholic chastity, Amalia Mesa Baines is both complicating this image of Catholic chastity while also reminding viewers of the European hegemony of beauty standards that have excluded women of color for centuries. Yet in describing her decision to incorporate this image, Mesa Baines remarks, Venus to me was the other side of the church. It was this very sensual, erotic positioning of the woman's body. I know they were subordinated by the view that was given to them, but they were so gorgeous. I felt a kind of connectedness between the satin of the dresses and the texture of the skin. This willingness to name the practices of subordination alongside her sense of the Venus being so gorgeous, speaks to Mesa Baines's willingness as an artist to name and play with, rather than simply disavow or denounce, her conflicted and desirous impulses. In her desire to include the Venus of Urbino, we see a characteristic Rasquache refusal to draw clear lines between that which should be abandoned or relinquished and that which might ultimately prove useful or come in handy, or that at minimum remains meaningful. In Mesa Baines's recent work, cabinets of curiosity, Wunderkammern, have served as a pivotal source of inspiration and points of reference. The cabinets of curiosity and chambers of wonder that emerged in Renaissance Europe were a way to display the rare, precious, and unknown, while also offering and conveying a sense of the mysterious. For her installation, of which this is a part, the New World Wunderkammer, the artist drew on the collection of UCLA's Fowler Museum, building a wall-side cupboard and filling the shelves of the museum's collection of Hispanic colonial objects and indigenous and African figures, masks, and carved objects. In his essay on Mesa Baines's The New World Wunderkammer, Ibarra-Frausto offers a brief history of these cabinets of wonder, noting how people in all cultures and in all times, as he puts it, are marked with an intense fascination with those things or events that are unusual, unexpected, exotic, extraordinary, or rare. Ibarra-Frausto notes how things, quote, outside the ordinary provoke us, especially when they have the capacity to excite the emotional response of surprise, astonishment, or admiration, unquote. Yet while celebrating the desire for wonder and enchantment, Ibarra-Frausto also directs our attention to the ways in which Mesa Baines's installation creates a space to consider how these wonderful Mesoamerican objects, with their subtle beauty, were plundered from the Americas, and how other regions newly explored and colonized by European conquerors. These marvelous objects entered the cabinets of curiosity as displaced objects, reimagined to fit European categories and experiences. As he observes in working with the Fowler Museum, Mesa Baines creates a space where this violent history can be encountered, explored, and perhaps transformed into something else. Put somewhat differently, in the New World Wunderkammer, Mesa Baines creates a decolonial heterotopia, one that allows viewers to reconsider how museums are sites of both pleasure and colonial complicity. The Fowler is a site of renewal and resonance, where a Chicana feminist can create anew, while also reflecting the legacies and practices of imperialism and wealth extraction from colonized population. The artist's engagement with the Wunderkammern reveals how political remembrances of injustice, sorrow, and death are also enmeshed in a world of marvels, beauty, and wonder. So one reason I'm drawn to Rasquachismo is because I think it's an alternative infrastructure for how subjects and communities might think and act politically, particularly now, particularly in the context of widespread forms of dysfunction in which so much around us, I think, appears broken, useless, and in need of discarding altogether. Yet rather than turn to familiar practices of affective withholding or scarcity logics, Rasquachismo helps us think more capaciously and creatively when approaching the work of repair, resistance, and renovation. What would it mean for us to try to bring a Rasquache sensibility to more of our political imaginings? How might we gather in a spirit of creativity, conservation, resourcefulness, and inventiveness to rethink and take up civic practices that we might have previously considered as used up, useless, broken, or a type of trash? A Rasquache orientation invites us to look at this messy and abundant inheritance and say, what can I use here? What still has value? What if I looked at it or I used it in a different way? Perhaps this nation does not work the way we were told it works. How else might it work? What if we look at it in a new way? There's a lot here. What else can it do? Bringing together bits of feeling, fragments of belief, saved and discarded ideologies that circulate in our politics leaves open the possibility that something that others might want to throw out today might prove useful or provide meaning and satisfaction tomorrow. That even amid the damage and the shattered pieces, there is still the possibility of beauty and survival and use. Embracing innovative practices of layering, and if we embrace these practices of layering and accumulation, a Rasquache orientation both includes and exceeds the logic of either patriotism or reckoning. And I think it's important to think about that. It both includes and exceeds the logic of patriotism and reckoning, making room for affectively abundant and ambivalent encounters with texts and ideas that produce complex feelings of joy, fascination, grief, anger, horror, pleasure, and love. It's my contention that an embrace of scholarly and historical abundance, is just one example, can help make the right's dreams of book banning, elimination, and indoctrination look as small and repellent and unappealing as they really are. Perhaps, in this way, various structures of abundance, including Rasquachismo and Domesticana, can be part of a reparative ethos that is inconvenient and, dare I say, maybe even unbearable to fascist world building. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Beltran, and we will start with Professor Pitts.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much, Steve, as well, for this invitation to engage your most recent thinking and writing on the topic of affective politics, aesthetics, and the multiracial right. So I'm a big fan of your work, Christina, in political thought, and given my own training in political philosophy, Latinx studies, and women of color feminisms, your work has been pivotal in helping me understand the many and varied affective aesthetic and normative textures that become legible or illegible under the category of Latinos. So your work also particularly resonates with me as someone who grew up in a Central American family in Florida during peak decades of the war on drugs, where the military, prisons, immigration enforcement, and policing refracted across our communities, both shaping life chances, employment, and civic order, and simultaneously surveilling, brutalizing, maiming, and confining our same communities. So Florida is also known for its conservative Cuban politics, among other forms of multiracial and multi-ethnic conservatisms, which you mention in the broader book project. So your work is likewise illuminating in that it helps me make sense of the everyday forms of Latino life that I've come to know, and offers ways to address Latino life in a manner that doesn't present our many and varied communities as somehow miraculously politically cohesive, nor as mere victims, dupes, or derivatives of other seemingly more powerful political forces. I think this is a complexity that I very much appreciate, and I hope to fortify even when conversations about Latinx groups become challenging. So Christina's book, in her concluding analysis of logics of scarcity and a Rasquache ethos of abundance as a counter to eliminativist trajectories, are thus necessary, both as a method, I think, for historical analysis and in our present moment. And by this, I mean that while models of actuarial risk or hypersecuritization are certainly features of neoliberalism of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, logics of scarcity, rationing, national austerity, and political clientelism have circulated across the national histories of the Americas for many, many generations. So notably, Christina's work connects us to the numerous multiracial and multi-ethnic conservatisms across Latin America and the Caribbean and many other places, of which many of us from the diaspora are all too familiar. I need only mention my own family that includes one aunt who was a somocista and a supporter of a dictator, and her sister, my abuela, who identified with peasant struggle instead and defiantly named her son after the militant anti-imperial leader Cesar Sandino. This mixture across the political spectrum was a fact of Nicaraguan life across many families in the first half of the 20th century and is still so today in the US and the Americas. In this, Christina locates a crucial logic of scarcity that's driving both the right and the far right in the US, and in those various forms of diversity among the right and the far right. And this logic of scarcity is also trapping leftists and liberals, as she notes, in a dialectical struggle that only resolves in a yet still more moderate struggle for resources and recognition. Her work also, this logic of scarcity also results in what she describes as affective withholdings that can prevent open dialogue and contestation with some of the very conflicted desires, life choices, and practices that many of us have, including the ones that we may feel ashamed to admit. And I know my time here is short, so I'm going to shift now to some of my questions for you, Cristina, which I hope will be in the spirit of building alongside and with your framework. And I'll pose just two here, one of which begins to ask who some of your comrades in struggle for a Rasquache ethos might be. And the second, more pointed, I think, is about gendered relations of affect within a Rasquache and Domesticana ethos of abundance, of which I'll say a bit more. So first, perhaps as an aside, Cristina mentions in the paper version how for leftists and liberals an aesthetics of injustice is often characterized by beauty, pleasure, and lavish abundance for some, while an aesthetics of justice is often characterized by absence, equality, and denial. And I certainly concede this point in the sense that you're noting here. There can certainly be trenchant forms of austerity, fatigue, and burnout on the left that places a somewhat Protestant work ethic among struggles against capitalism, sexism, racism, and so on, that can feel anxiety-ridden, exhausting, and even sometimes outright boring. Feminist sex wars and critiques of pornography are just one site where this kind of critique has been levied, and where among others, kink enthusiasts, queer theorists, and creatives of all sort sought to reclaim spaces for pleasure, desire, and play in a world that would otherwise demand of all of us a more heteronormative missionary role in the bedroom and on the screen. Yet Cristina also mentions a movement that is close to my heart and my thinking, namely abolition struggles, and worlds without policing and prisons among such potentially joyless and abstaining political trajectories. And with this, I take her point that maybe mainstream calls for defunding the police certainly weren't a sexy or enticing rallying cry. Perhaps neither is the solely negative articulation that she alludes to in a world without X, Y, or Z. However, as someone who's deeply grown through the writings and pedagogy and worldviews of Black feminisms, transnational feminisms, and Latina feminisms, I don't find that kind of austere anti-pleasure politics among the abolitionists that I know. For example, like Miriam Kaba, Alicia Garza, Angela Davis, and Adrienne Marie Brown, among others. Each of these feminist abolitionists, as I see in your footnote, and I did see your footnote mentioning how women of color feminisms and queer of color critique are allied potentially in critiquing logics of scarcity. These feminist abolitionists instead do precisely the kinds of complex, imaginative, aesthetic, and communicative work of meeting people where they are, on their own terms of struggle, within their own worlds of sense, and do so from a determination for movement building that Davis, for example, says must be irresistible to those who witness it. And also, given Davis's own political trajectory throughout the 1970s, there's no doubt that even the aesthetic politics of the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and the Brown Berets were themselves making movidas to present these radical movements as stylish, beautiful, and aesthetically enticing to young people across the U.S. and abroad. And today, we still get a refrain from abolitionists like Adrienne Marie Brown that pleasure is a measure of freedom. And she points our attention towards emergent strategies that stem from the ongoing conditions of life and affect and hold true to, for example, Octavia Butler's principle from Parable of the Sower, that all that you change changes you, the only lasting truth is change. So such frameworks surely feel like loosenings, queerings, experimentations, and also appear to hold space for the inevitability of contradictions and conflicts. Hence, also the robust work in transformative justice, conflict resolution, harm reduction, nonviolent communicative strategies, and so on that are, I think, abundant within abolition feminisms. In fact, perhaps the most obvious paradox or juxtaposition is that abolition is creative and largely interpreted by abolition feminists as a positive project, not a negative one, which is perhaps what defunding the police as a political strategy either underemphasized or sometimes entirely omitted. So my question here is simply to invite Cristina to share more on what that footnote regarding how a Rasquache ethos of abundance might potentially already share a world with these forms of abolitionist feminisms and queer of color critique. And lastly, and I know that I'm short on time here, my second question is about how Mesa Baines' Domesticana and Ibarra Frausto's Rasquachismo might respond to the very gendered demarcations of pleasure politics across the political spectrums today. And I'll present it in the simplest way I can by giving a brief and embarrassing anecdote. So namely, the algorithms on my social media usually waffle between pitching products, services, and apps to me for, on the one hand, queer and trans masked people who are interested in mental health, gardening, dogs, and leftist pleasure politics. And on the other, I get a lot of content for cisgender, hetero short kings who are interested in working out, finding a nice pair of pants, and managing erectile dysfunction. And I'll leave it as an aside to whether there's any truth to these algorithmic associations. But the reason I bring them up is that such algorithms are definitely trying to tap into an attention economy, yes, but they're also trying to tap into sources of pleasure, enticement, and fulfillment for consumers like me. And I'm not trying to drag your beautifully crafted argument into AI debates or the dregs of internet marketing. What I'm interested in is in how every streaming platform and social media app is already making fine-grained aesthetic distinctions about how algorithmic subjects like me are gendered, aged, and racialized, and they're perpetually guessing what I might find pleasurable, exciting, and interesting. And again, mine just happen to be trans guys, butch lesbians, and cis masked dude bros. And I'm sure you all have your own, right? Okay, I'm sure you have your own. My question is whether Rasquachismo and Domesticana aesthetics tracks pleasure politics beyond frames of binary masc and femme, and how they might work through the many varied contradictions and convergences within, among, and beyond masculinities and femininities that span leftist, liberal, and also right-wing forms of gendered pleasure, gendered racialized pleasure. To be clear, and this is my last paragraph, Rasquachismo and Domesticana aesthetics definitely appeal to me as a queer and trans Latinx person. But, for example, how might a resourceful working-class neo-Baroque aesthetic sensibility, as you describe it, resonate with those same cis hetero short kings who get pitched my same social media ads? This is one of the struggles that liberals and leftists are waging with the right now. How to build irresistible movements that feel like they resonate across genders, racial groups, ages, and so on. And from a theoretical place, I vibe with the affective politic here. From a practical and everyday sensibility, though, when I teach Rasquache and Domesticana aesthetics, it's still the women of color and the queers in the room who tend to be most attentive and excited by its ethos. Everyone else kind of tunes out or nods approvingly like they're giving due diligence and likely their bare minimum. I don't mean to end on a pessimistic note, given the beautiful work you've offered, and perhaps I'm now dragging your work back into a zero-sum thinking, but now about the affective attention economy. And maybe a Rasquache ethos is already at work among gendered formations today. And now I got some like wacky examples, but like, okay, maybe, for example, would Bad Bunny's reclamation of the folk genre of plena and el gran combo perhaps fortify a Rasquache ethos, right? I mean, we could think of reggaeton, dembow, reparto, reclaiming merengue, reclaiming the Cuban rumba clave, reclaiming hip hop, or having this kind of constellation of ordering of other genres. I'm also thinking, again, back to my own algorithms. What would a Domesticana workout be, right? Like a Rasquache workout. Like, what does that mean? And how would it combat healthism, sanism, fat phobia, ableism? Like, how would it respond to that? It makes me think of, I don't know if anybody saw Frankie Quinones' recent Grammy announcement where he does Cholo Fit. Has anybody seen Cholo Fit? Where he's talking about a fitness workout for Chicanos, and he's like, you lift up the tamal to the light to see whether it's salsa roja or salsa verde. Like that's the move. So I don't know. Generally, I simply want to know more about the gendered capaciousness and potential struggles for building affective infrastructures of abundance that you may already see in Mesa Baines and Ibarra Frausto. And the thing is, I feel them too. And now I think we just need a good hook. All right. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Professor Pitts. Now we'll hear from Professor Beard.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you so much, Professor Johnston and the Department of Political Science for having me here, and to all the people who cleaned and prepared this beautiful space where we gather. And I want to thank you, Professor Beltran, for sharing your work and for the brilliant writing and thinking you do which has profoundly shaped my own. I've been carrying your first book in my hot little hand since the moment I got it. It's been a real honor to get to think with this piece this month and to be one of your interlocutors today. I also want to acknowledge this place as the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. Since I read Professor Beltran's paper 4 weeks ago, I have actually not been able to stop thinking about Rasquachismo. I'm fully obsessed now. I'm losing sleep. But with my time today, I want to reflect on just a few things about purity and impurity in politics, in the we of politics, and about the political significance of non-discarding. With a clear eye for what is at stake in this moment, in the fight for livable, just, and beautiful worlds, one of the things Professor Beltran does is to inventory the axioms and affective practices of liberals and leftists, including forms of unwillingness to engage with or envision a we with those who are not proper subjects. While the right is finding wins with a paradoxical combination of domination and inclusion, meanness and exuberance. Part of what's at stake in Professor Beltran's inventory of identifications and disidentifications and affective rules and affective withholdings is a strategic question: how are we going to win more livable worlds? And relatedly, a question about process and prefigurative politics, which is to say that it matters how we do and how we make things along the way. We can ask, how and where are logics of domination at work in our projects, and how can we loosen them? I think Maria Lugones' account of purity as a logic of domination and accounts of identification from other thinkers can be helpful here and lead us back to Beltran's project. A passion for purity, Lugones writes, and an urge to control are conceptually related. The lover of purity, Lugones explains, parades himself, and I follow her use of pronouns here, which are intentionally gendered. He parades himself as pure and condemns racialized and gendered others as impure, as passionate, needy, sensuous, confused, as remainders from a delusional parsing out between pure and impure. The lover of purity is self-deceptive, is locked out of self-knowledge and locked out of knowledge about the world, and is, as Lugones puts it, locked out of perceiving richly. I think we can hear resonances here with Charles Mill's account of an epistemology of ignorance and James Baldwin's account of white innocence. There's important connections here also with ways to think about identity and identification, with forms of political identity being made up of many, many, many political identifications, these more micro-level practices, and identifications are always identifications with people, with ideas, with nations, with institutions, and which, as Teresa Brennan explains, get papered over for an identity to cohere, because they're full of contradictions. Some coherence is needed, but Beltran asks us if we can stretch our capacity for seeing our contradictory impulses and our contradictory identifications, our contradictory longings, and stretch our capacity to make forms of a political we that likewise are full of conflict and contradiction. What if we didn't require such thick layers of papering? What if we could find coherence in large formations that are more heterogeneous? Indeed, in the face of purity politics, Lugones theorizes holding multiplicity as a powerfully resistant act. And I think this is part of what Beltran proposes in Affective Abundance and finds in Rasquachismo and Domesticana. Beltran's affective abundance opens up ways to think about non-eliminationist, resistant, and creative practices at multiple scales, from personal levels to large political collectivities. Affective abundance helps us loosen our grip on narrow and zero-sum ways of thinking politically that are stifling us in order to make room for and find more capacious, full ways of creating and sharing worlds. Rasquachismo and Domesticana orient us not towards not discarding, but repurposing things, layering patterns upon patterns, towards making things, not just for function, not just for survival, but for beauty and expression, and making those things with what is at hand. One of the most potent things that Beltran's reading of Rasquachismo as a political ethos opens up in how we understand our political world is a way of seeing elements of our world as having quite a great capacity for possible new uses, forms, and meanings. And also, relatedly, an eye for what might be, what something could perhaps become. Here we're not just talking about material objects, coffee cans, strings, mirrors, but also, as Beltran helps us see, people's feelings and their identifications. None of these things are fixed, settled, stable, or final in their form or meaning. In the Rasquachismo, there's a willingness to not yet know how it will all come together, or if something will even ultimately be a part of the thing we make. Rather than clinging rigidly to certainty, and rather than clinging rigidly to an already stale plan, the stance is one of openness to things unfolding, and the practices include gathering and holding on to things on the terms that they might have some potential, soon or at some future point. Maybe at one point something was a jump rope made of a cotton string and brightly colored plastic segments, and now it's a garland for a chain link gate. Maybe something once was a tire that propelled a car forward, and now it's a brightly painted planter for succulent plants. Maybe it's a plastic bottle, and we're not sure, but it seems it could have some potential, and maybe we won't really know how that will unfold for a while, but we're game to wait. Maybe it once was your grief and your shame, the way you were taught gender, crushingly, and then it became something that was mean and afraid when you grew up. But it could be something else, quite dazzling in its love for beauty and for others in our world. Rather than seeing ourselves and each other as, for better or for worse, fully cooked political subjects, what if we saw ourselves and each other as in process, as unfolding? I mean, thank God some people saw and see me as in process, or I would not have had and today would not have such good company as I unlearn things and get more free. But two, as good students of Rasquachismo, if we take non-fixity seriously, non-fixity of people's identifications, of their interpretations of the world, of their attachments and their alignments, if we take all this non-fixity seriously, we realize we can't take for granted existing left or liberal identifications. That is, we don't have the corner on remaking this or that. People can and do get pulled into other projects. Liberals and leftists thought we had the corner on multiracialism, for example, but that's clearly up, at least partly up, for grabs, including into projects that are mean-spirited, unlike Rasquachismo, but nonetheless are recombinatory projects. In the non-discarding, in the making something with what domination politics discards, whether those domination politics be championed in the right wing's avowedly eliminationist politics, or whether they be coursing in other ways through liberal and left-wing politics, I see Rasquachismo and Domesticana as a political ethos as having good company in kindred projects. There's too many to name. But in Marsha P. Johnson's bright headdresses she made from discarded flowers and other materials found in the Manhattan Flower District, and in her and Sylvia Rivera's transformation of a falling apart building without working pipes into Star House. In performance art of the Sins Invalid collective of the 2010s, who, countering the logics of discarding and disappearing our various disabled body minds, would not make anything unless everyone would be there. Or in Kathy Cohen's articulation of a queer politics that envisions making something powerful out of all of us who are the remainders of, on the outside of, heteronormativity. And Rasquachismo, in Beltran's hands, seems kindred with, rather than different than, contemporary abolitionist praxis. So I'm agreeing with Professor Pitts here. Abolition as proliferative, as not an absence, but a presence, as filling every nook of our world with experiments, 1 million experiments, as Mariam Kaba puts it, experiments in setting up our social and political world differently, and in doing this, on the ground of and by the people in what Gilmore calls forgotten places, those places discarded across decades of organized state abandonment. I'm interested in the way that the meaning of something changes through its recombination with other seemingly unfitting objects. The proximities, the combinations themselves, seem to be part of what makes something into something new. It makes me think of June Jordan's essay on Jesse Jackson's 1988 campaign and her reflections on and delight in that constituency's loud, needful heterogeneity, including with some people who had some major racism to work through, but that what they were, who they were, was starting to mean something quite different as they were in the constituency, and they were clearly going to be changed as they were hailed by Jackson and his clear articulation of policies for small farmers, for poor people, etc. I'm also struck by temporality to Rasquache, an attunement in the present to the presence of an array of possible futures. I'm struck by the interim time when stuff is gathered but not yet made into something, saved but not yet reassembled, as Beltran cites scholars of Amalia Mesa Baines. Mesa Baines made her altars from items that she'd been gathering and preserving over long periods of time. And finally, if gender domination and migrant suffering are glue for the recombinatory and chaotic assemblages of the contemporary right wing, how might we think about glue in making liberatory Rasquache political creations? Or do we even need glue? If it's really actually a politics of attraction and magnetism to some beautiful shared worlds of thriving and safety? Or if we do need glue, can it be glittery? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Beard. We welcome your questions. Charlotte.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I fangirled a little bit when I got
Charlotte, I think we're going to get a microphone for you. Okay.
I was really excited. This work, I think, really, Charlotte, sorry. Really interested me in some of this narrative that you get between craft and art of like men create art and that painting you hold is by a male artist and women create craft and that's somehow different and lesser, and thinking about the image of the house that you pulled up of like, I would think that the public would glom onto that as like a craft work. Which led me to like two kind of questions with your work of typically craft is seen as women's work. And so if we are taking this position of like, maybe this is how we should approach politics, is this like reconstruction or this crafting of a possible future, is this overly burdensome onto some gendered position of like, is it women that have to do the crafting? And then the second, like maybe other side of the coin, and maybe this is me being zero-sum, is how do we ask men or people who are embodying a position of masculinity to craft with us if they want to create art, which isn't a reconstruction of things. Like I don't know how we ask people to craft with us if they don't want to.
A couple of questions.
What do you prefer?
A couple.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm a poli-sci major. How do you talked about it a little bit at the very beginning, but how would you recommend having the conversation with the other side in a way that doesn't devolve into these downward phrases of enemies, terrorists, communists, fascists, all those ways? Because whenever I try to have that conversation with those who might not share my views, that's what it always devolves into.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I really needed to hear this today. I will give you my question up front and then just a little slight background to it. So my question is, I want to get back to the people part. And you've just raised that because I've heard that in Professor Pitt's question as well. You know, what would this look like in our everyday interactions, on campus, off campus? So the background is we are just in the process of seeing a beautiful college that we created here for intersectional inquiry called the School for Cultural and Social Transformation be dismantled. As the former dean of that college, I tried to come up with a mantra to present to students, and you will see why I need to read your work. And my mantra was from anger to seductive kindness to structural change. But seeing that as synchronic, right, not diachronic. Never leave anger behind. Yeah. Anger is our fuel, right? That is our righteous fuel. Then I've struggled with the middle term, and you've given me a new middle term today, you know, really all three of you. Because seductive kindness, right, are we back to a gender trap with that? Does that sound too white, too female, too something? Although I found people really attached to that term, and that practicing my anger, using seductive kindness as a face of my anger, more pleasurable, really in line with queer camp. And I kind of heard that in what Professor Pitts was doing. The supreme generosity and joy of camp being that middle term. But as I practice it daily, it is my way of hastening structural change and feeling structural change. And just the last thing I'll say, this is my experiment, but I want to hear what others you've done. As a queer, trans, non-binary person, I try to go to what I consider to be the most difficult lectures to hear from people who are really wanting to threaten our existence. And to go and not to talk with the speakers, they're paid to do this work, but to connect with the people in the audience and say, hey, can we grab a cup of coffee? Can we go and listen to each other? And really just to do the work of holding story. So I don't know how far you would go in this direction to say, not even getting into policy, not even trading ideas about what is the thing we're going to politically do, but literally tell me your story.
Yeah.
I will tell you my story, and that will be the holding of the bits and pieces for now. I don't know what the next stage is. So at any rate, the whole question is just, what have you tried on the people part of this? Such a beautiful talk. I feel you are saying, I dare you to withstand our gorgeousness. And I am so down with that. So thank you. This was just so illuminating today.
These are so great. These questions are so wonderful. And I really invite Andrea and Lisa to chime in however you want, because I'm just thinking with all of you as well. So I think that so this question of Charlotte's craft and this question of, one thing I want to talk maybe first about camp, because one of the really interesting things about, is this on? Or am I just yelling at you? I'm just holding up an object. Am I doing it right? Is it on there?
I think it's as long as it's up.
Okay, I'm on. One of the really interesting things is Tomás Ibarra Frausto is very honest and very open and talks a lot about the fact that he wrote the essay in '89 after reading Susan Sontag's notes on camp. And it was notes on camp that he was both in dialogue with and thinking with. And Ibarra Frausto's own status as a gay man and sort of his own thinking with that, I think, is both a really important undergirding logic that circulates in the text. And so one thing I'm really interested in is, in thinking about camp, is that one thing Sontag says that I just think is useful to think with here is Sontag says, camp is not just inversion. It's not just a good taste, a bad taste. Sontag says, it's actually often a supplementary logic. And some aesthetic theorists have talked about that as they describe it as either the why not or the what if. Like, why not put that on with that? Why not wear that with that? Why not? Like, why not? Or what if? What if you did that? What if you put that with that? That would be awesome. So I love the idea of like the why not and the what if. And I think Rasquachismo is very much embedded in the why not and the what if, and the possibility of those sorts of layerings. And so when I think of inviting people, the question of sort of craft and art, I don't know. I think it's about telling people. I think it's interesting to say what areas do we feel comfortable doing things in. I think one of the interesting things about Rasquache is sometimes it's about like keeping your house going. It's about like, you got to use things in your house that are broken and you got to make them work with what you have. And so those things could play out in gendered ways, but it's also an invitation of like all of us have to deal with the glitch, right? All of us have to figure out how to work this. So what if you did this? What if, and to invite everyone to say, well, this is fun, try this, try doing this. And so, one of the ways I think about it is, one way I talk about it a little bit in the chapter is I think about the fact that, sometimes when we talk about like decolonizing the curriculum, it can be a language of like what we're going to take out, or sometimes my students will be like, I'll be like, you should read Aristotle. And they're like, oh, European, no, I don't want to read Aristotle. And they have reasons, right? Because they feel like their stories were not told. Right, the histories that they are committed to were not heard. So there's a real reason for feeling like some stories were glorified and celebrated and treated as legitimate and classic, and other stories of the political were not seen, right? And I'm trying to say, why not Combahee and Aristotle? Why not Melville and Audre Lorde? Like, who says it's this or that? Like, fuck that. Like, why? I want all of it. It's a massive intellectual buffet. I want to eat it, all of it. And the joy of us is I'm not going to be there saying, you can't talk about slavery. You can't talk about trans politics. You can't talk about Silvio Rivera. I'm saying, talk about Silvio Rivera. Talk about Melville. Talk about Thoreau. Talk about Whitman. Talk about Audre Lorde. Talk about Ansaldúa. Like, why aren't we talk about all of it. In our work, it's a beautiful world of ideas and possibilities. And none of it is off limits. And all of it is amazing, and all of it might upset you and piss you off and excite you, and that's what we're here for, to do together. So, like, my whole thing, I always just feel like, why do I want to be a cop? I don't want to be a cop. I don't want to police the boundaries of your ideas, right? And so we're not cops. I don't want to police your thinking. I want you to go find your stuff, go find your visions. And I feel like, for me, that's the ethos of Latino studies. That's the ethos of ethnic studies and women's studies and trans and queer theory was we were engaging in we were thinking about desire and pleasure. And, I just feel like there's an orientation we could offer to that I think is always endemic to our work, but I think sometimes it doesn't always get fully. So, the question of abolition that got brought up, and I know when I said abolition might be a scarcity logic, I'm like, I'm going to piss some people off here. And I knew that, but what I wanted to think about, not so much that what abolition theorizing is doing. I think what abolition theorizing is doing is replete with abundance. I think the question becomes, how come large publics don't know that? What are we doing as organizers or in terms of articulating this where people see that word as implying things are being taken away? That they're losing safety, that they're losing, and I think it also is this question of when I walk around New York City, the cops are black and brown primarily. And those cops are there for all kinds of reasons. And so for me, affective abundance is to say, they're there because they want good jobs, they want insurance, they want healthcare. Some of them are there to do domination, right? Obviously, some people are drawn to policing because they want the boot on the neck. There are people like that drawn into different jobs, right? But there are also people there who are there because they want to save people, they want to help people. What would it mean to produce a politics that can see their desires for a better world, right? And can talk to them, not just about them, but to them, right? So it's more about how do we expand abolitionist imaginaries? This is another idea that might not be a happy, I don't know, but do we need to call it abolition? There's a real encounter with that's our word, that's our vision. Is it persuasive to a lot of people? What if we called it something else? What if we used it in a different way? I don't really care the word. I mean, the word has a beautiful history, but lots of words I want to draw people into that politics. So I'll call it fried chicken. I don't care. I want it to be something people can imagine themselves living within. So it's more this question of, I think we are comrades in all these ways, and it's more or when we sometimes we'll describe a gay assimilationist imaginary. And I'm like, people who want to get married or join the military have a lot of freedom dreams too. I want to be in, so I think it might be this question of to Eric's point, how do we share stories? How do we, and maybe sometimes it isn't just let's talk about the shutdown, because I know where that's going to end, right? But it might be the point Kathleen made, what are your stories? How did you become who you are? What do you love? What are your guilty pleasures? What's on your algorithm? Maybe it's having those conversations that opens up something where we start to see each other in ways that we didn't. But the question of Rasquache, I always think Rasquache has a little bit to do this. Rasquache can turn into hoarding, right? Because you don't want to throw anything away. And that can get super messy. So I think about that too, about what does it mean to hold everything? Is there a danger to holding everything? Can it become overwhelming? So there are risks here. And to Lisa's point, I think just one last point I want to think about is, I think the right is really good at abundance logics right now. And Lisa used this great term of exuberance and domination. And so I think that they're often really good at saying you can say everything, you can do there's an exuberance on the right that I think we have to really think about. And I think one question, though, is their exuberance underneath it is an enormous amount of not just zero-sum thinking, but scarcity. You can't talk about slavery. You can't talk about settler colonialism. You can't talk about indigenous, you can't talk about those things. And I want to say, we can talk about that. And we can also talk about the fact that we love this place. And we can talk about both those things. And they won't let you talk about that. But sometimes we won't let each other talk about that we love this place. Right? That we're really good at renunciation and denouncement, but it's harder for us to admit that we have deep attachments to people in place. And maybe that's called patriotism for a lot of people. And what does that mean? Right? Why can't we talk about that? So I just think we need to kind of be that expansive place. And that's a scary place, because that's going to admit that I dig some Ken Burns documentaries a lot. And I'm both ashamed of that and super into it all at the same time, right? I have critiques and I'm also crying, right? It's all of it is happening. I have all the feelings. And I just think we should be more honest about the fact that most of us have all the feelings. And maybe having all the feelings together can be a site of loosening. That's one thing. And I see questions.
Ray, did you want to
I mean, sure. I mean, I think actually, what was your name? Charlotte. Charlotte, I think your question was really like the last part of it of like, okay, how do we invite masc and like cis hetero men into a crafting project was exactly the kind of thinking that I was like, yeah, that's half of like how I'm, how we're navigating at least my algorithms. It's like, that's who they're pitching to. So that's also part of this project.
Yes.
But that's also why I thought it's, maybe where you ended, which was Rasquache as hoarding has an individualized model, as though what happens with like the pathologization of hoarding is that like it's, and I'm not saying this is not a really a serious concern for some folks, but that like if we think about a zero sum, if we think about Rasquache or affective aesthetic worlds as individualized, it can feel overwhelming, but that's not, I don't think Ibarra Frausto and Amalia Mesa Baines are thinking about it that way. They're thinking a collective project that like they do visual art or they do, there's writing and there's like theater involved and like really collective practices that are part of that project. So it's not like like affect hoarded in a room or an emotional kind of extreme. It's really actually kind of a collective sense of like where among us, how among us, when among us. And I think that's why I thought of Bad Bunny, because I thought like what's happening with Bad Bunny is like that is reaching to the crafty masks, right? Like that is, like actually queering what might otherwise be viewed as like cis hetero Latinx or Puerto Rican masculinity. And so like I think what's interesting is like this kind of like where among us, like let's do that kind of collective work that doesn't have to get rid of, it doesn't have to say, oh, those sexist machistas who are blah blah, like it's not doing that. And I think that's something about a kind of the ethos part of what you're describing, which is less the kind of like it's all on me to do a kind of critical work, because in fact it is that collective promptings of saying like, is that a problematic desire? Like, oh crap, I didn't know that. That's cringe, right? Like you find out by like being confronted with that or trying to which I think also just briefly taps into something really interesting about Amalia Mesa Baines' Domesticana, because I think part of the intimacy of altar building for her was also this like challenge to the public-private divide, which that is, I think, a really important piece about the kind of politicization of the intimate and the kind of what's viewed as private or as kind of like a craft, right? Something that's done out of the kind of larger mainstream platforms or major world, kind of institutional spaces. And I think really that too can also be like, where and how among us has this been happening in ways that are not out in a kind of like seemingly visible mainstream. So it gives us that kind of prompt to say like, what's the kind of intimate practices that are already happening that can then be part of that Rasquache or the Mexicana ethos?
I don't have a comment. I just love the sentence that I heard. I dare you to withstand our gorgeousness.
Yes.
So your discussion of abundance logics. Oh, Alex. Discussion of abundance logics and the social imaginary recalls me to Butler's Who's Afraid of Gender, and sort of how it explores this perverse politics of inclusivity, or maybe all-inclusive exclusivity, and the loosening of social concepts as a tool of like demonization and control, and the concept of social specters. And the more this happens, the more threatened people feel, and the stronger the tactic becomes in a sort of spiral. And it's this negative spiral seems far easier to me to fall into than sort of patterns of radical acceptance. So my question is, how do we combat this seemingly very, very effective tactic of ever expanding the enemy, making our neighbors harder to reach when their stances are further calcified by this fear of the other? And how can we use concepts of Rasquache, and can we retool this negativity, this fear, into something positive for change?
And we also have one right there.
Hi, my name is Lily. I'm studying political science and economics here. But I was just wondering how you would like differentiate in both like the political sphere and just like on a basic like consumerism level, the difference between like overconsumption or like oversaturation of like propaganda and news between your idea of abundance and what like abundance means.
That's a great question.
One
I mean,
more.
okay.
Hi, my name is Bree, and I'm a senior getting ready to graduate soon. And I was just wondering what advice you could give young scholars who are wanting to start their research in identity and effective abundance and power through a political and theoretical lens.
Congratulations. I will ponder on that one. I want to think about that one. I mean, it's a hard moment, right? And an exciting and necessary moment, where like all of you are so desperately needed, and yet are entering a world where they are trying to stop all of that. This question of Alex's question about how to avoid these sort of calcified accounts. I think one of the things, like, I think the zero-sum scarcity logics that, I think that the right's view of manhood and masculinity is so sad and so small, right? But it seems really big, right? It seems like aggressive, and you can, but it also is telling men to be like, you can be, this is what a man is. And it's like, so, and I feel like, what would a different vision of saying, you do you. Like, I feel like, I mean, my thing is like, you want to be you want to be a trad wife? Be a trad wife. Mazel tov. Enjoy your life. Like, what you can't do is deny my rights as a feminist. But if that is your form of thriving, then that is your form of thriving. You want to be a mixed martial arts? Be a mixed martial arts. You want to be an astronaut or a fireman? Whatever. What is exciting to you? What kind of world do you want to be in? Like, I think there should be a kind of logic of like, there's so many different ways, but you want to be a stay-at-home dad? You want to be an artist? You want to be a crafts person? You want to be trans? You want to be like, I think our world should be like, there are so many different ways you can hold your masculinity that gives you joy. You should have your right to that. Your life should be what beautiful world would you like to inhabit? What does being in your body feel good to you? Yeah, then that should be you. What does that feel like for all of us, right? And unlike the right that's saying like, eat a bunch of protein, be this kind of man, be this kind, that just sounds exhausting and tiring to be told what you are, right? And I think there should be something sort of inviting about like, I think your thriving is beautiful. You want to be a farmer? What do you want to do? That's amazing. Go be that. But you know what you can't stop is you can't stop other people's dreams and their thrivings, right? Like that's the line. When you try to exclude and dominate and eliminate other forms of ways of being a man, that's where we're like, no. That's the fascist impulse, to erase those forms of manhood, to erase those forms of life. No, that's the problem. But I think, that idea of a kind of celebration of different possibilities is part of saying like that's what our story is, right? But I think figuring out how to talk about that, and I think this question of like individualized and collective. One thing I like about Rasquachismo is it reminds me in some ways of the way Hannah Arendt's logics. Arendt never just talks about the collective or the individual, right? It's always this relational. Power is between subjects. Action only occurs between people. And yet there's also natality. No person is the same as any other person who's been born or will exist. And so there's something that takes seriously the fact that you are you, that you live in your body and in your life, right? That there's something individuating that's not individualistic. It's not a kind of liberal individualism necessarily, but it is about you, right? And the specialness of you. But that there's also something about the collective of us. And what I think is interesting about Rasquache is it might be a space where we can move between what is both individuating and what is collective. And it doesn't ask us to choose. Because I don't want to live in a world where I'm only in a collective space, right? I like spaces where I get to be not collective, but I also need to be in collective relationality with other people. So it doesn't ask you to make a kind of either or choice about that. It invites performances that might feel very personal and also might feel collective, right? So I think we do live within both of them. And part of the right story of that is it's either one is always an individual, it's always, it's inevitably collective. And I think that kind of logic is part of the problem. But that question of, what do we become together and do this kind of work? I think we need people to be asking these questions in different ways, right? And in describing, in pushing ourselves into maybe somewhat uncomfortable positions of what we've done really well and beautifully in the past and what we could do better, and be able to talk about all those things at the same time, right? I think that's one thing I think about. But I think you should follow what is exciting to you intellectually, and not worry about markets, which I know is a really hard thing to do. It feels impossible. I know. But I don't know. I think it's really important to start with what you care about the most. And if you don't start there, if you try to be strategic, you will be working on things that don't move you, and that just doesn't work. So I think you just have to follow what you care about, even though that feels terrifying in this moment, right? But I think what's more terrifying is to try to do something in the context of a world that doesn't really celebrate your existence, right? And I think the last thing about commodification, I was really struggling with this idea, like I'm talking about an abundance that is affective, not so much about stuff. And I think one thing about Rasquachismo is it's the way people create abundance out of scarcity. Like all the little broken things actually are a lot of things. Like when you look at all the things that like aren't working, you actually have a lot, right? And that's interesting. But it also, the other side of that is people like things that work, right? It's not fun to live in the glitch all the time. Right? And so also taking that seriously, that people want things that they want. But I think there is something interesting about trying to think of I wouldn't say it's anti-capitalist. It could be. For some it might be. But I think it's also something that's trying to think with commodities and things differently. And that might be a different orientation.
I was just thinking a little bit about, the things, and I know we're talking about affect and identifications more than we are material things, but I was struck a little bit in thinking about this piece in relationship to June Jordan's own like redesign ethics. And I think there's just such resonances and like some tensions, but not in a way that, I just think there's actually room for all of it. It's not like, this is the one plan and we will, like, it's like there's room for all of the different like design approaches or ways of gathering and remaking things. But like Jordan in her work, in her design writings, there's often a step of like clearing stuff out and like making room. Okay, what do we need space for? We need space for all these different ways that humans like to thrive. So in the context of like a children's room, it'd be like a space to like play games, a space to read books, a space to like, sit quietly, space to be loud and throw toys around. And so like how to actually kind of like set up spaces for like maximal human experience and expression. And so often there's like space clearing that's a part of her designs, and kind of like setting space up for people, for people to like do people things and like just really express and explore and live really fully and make a lot of art and like do all of that. But I think they all feel like connected to me, both of these orientations.
And just a quick thought, because I've been thinking now more about what you were just saying about like masculinities, you do you. I think I'm still lingering with that I'm trying to think through it, because one of the things that I'm hearing is like, well, there's if we're really thinking affective relationality, like where you ended with Arendt and where you're like affective and aesthetic and like these kind of like relational worldviews, like there are some forms of like common tropes among masculine folks that like require a relational like kind of dyad or multi-modality. And I just have two thoughts in mind. Savior complex needs someone to save, right? A protector needs some threat to a protected other, right? So like, because I'm thinking of the very obvious examples where you've mentioned and where I was mentioning of like, yeah, cops and military are like very obvious choices for some people who desire that kind of relational affective charge, right? So like masculinities, you do you is like, okay, join the military because you want to save people, but like that doesn't quite. But then I kept thinking with what you suggested, and I was like, okay, maybe where you ended, like, okay, making some things, and I'm not trying to be diminishing in this, but like, okay, making things smaller, more, and then I thought about like, okay, is it like, okay, folks who have that kink about savior and protectionism, like, and then folks who want to be a trad wife, like, do they find each other in peopling? And then like, is that then like small
enclaves of that. But then what it becomes is like, how do you reorient then so that like that kind of demand to either be a femme who needs to be saved, right? Because that's also the like kind of imperative demand, which is eliminatory for some folks, or like the demand that there is a threat to some other that then needs to be eliminated, right? Like that's the protectionist problem. Is like, is that a harm reduction problem, right? Is that a harm reduction problem where it's like, okay, like there's these like kinky little communities that like are like doing their like trad wife and protector thing, and that's a harm reduction scenario because what doesn't happen is that then those desires become the dominant desire for more, that everyone needs, all femmes need saving, or that all brown people are a threat, or black and brown people are a threat. So I guess I'm thinking harm reduction. I don't know, like masculinities, you do you, and a harm reduction model. Like, is that what we're talking about?
I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about, or I think about the idea of like, if you want to protect something, I always think about like, we need other forms of like, you can fight against climate change. I keep thinking of ways that people can harness the desire for risk and danger, and the fact that people want to fight for something larger than themselves. Right? There are people who, I mean, most of us want to be part of something larger than ourselves. And that desire to be part of something larger than ourselves can manifest in all kinds of ways. It can manifest in activism. It can manifest in art making. It can manifest in joining the military. It can manifest in becoming a police officer. It can manifest in a lot of ways. Some ways I worry about and they make me more uncertain, and other ways I'm more attuned to, right? They are attractive to me. But I also think like, why don't we think more about like, I think there are a lot of people who would like to help be part of saving the world. And that might be a form of, like, fighting to save the planet feels like a pretty glorious fight, right? And maybe that's a form of, like, protectionism that could be really beautiful and could be a protective desire to save something that could be that kind of energy in a really beautiful way, right? Or maybe, and also the realization that somebody might be something for a while and they might be something later. Somebody might want to be a trad wife for a while and then they might discover that that's not so great and they want to be a feminist, right? People are always in this process of becoming. And so making room for the different ways people are in a process of becoming and saying, well, you're oriented this way right now. It's not my favorite way of orienting, but I live in the world with you. And I don't get to just tell you to be only the things I love, right? I have to be like, that's giving you something, right? But where do we overlap in any way? Do we have places where we see each other, right? You're two sisters who are on the opposite side of the revolution, right? Like, where do we see each other? But at the same time, they might become something different. And so you leave open that door for like, well, something might come to mean something for you in a different moment. It feels like that's the kind of loosening that interests me. But it also means that there are people who are, they are inconvenient to me and I am inconvenient to them. But we're all here. And maybe that could become something.
All right, well, I think we have come to our allotted time. So please join me in thanking Professors Beltran, Pitts, and Beard.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming out. Feel free to stick around. Yeah, have a great rest of your day.